Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're diving into a seriously fascinating piece of historical and religious analysis. We are unpacking Islam and the world, the rise and decline of Muslims, and its effect on mankind. It's a hugely influential book by Sayyid Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi. And look, this isn't just your standard localized history. It's a sweeping, global thesis looking at how Islamic leadership, human morality, and the whole trajectory of world civilizations all tie together. It's a text that has sparked massive debate, and honestly, it asks questions that feel incredibly relevant to the anxieties we're dealing with today. Okay, let's dive right in and objectively unpack these complex arguments.
Right out of the gate, the translator's note hits us with this really powerful hook from Muhammad Asad. He says, it was not the Muslims that made Islam great. It was Islam that made the Muslims great. The translator uses this intentionally to set up the core philosophy of Nadwi's entire book. Nadwi is framing Islam not as this static thing or just a set of ancient historical rituals, but as a dynamic, complete way of life. It's presented as an eternal blueprint meant to cover absolutely everything: spiritual, material, moral, the whole shebang. And keeping that distinction in mind is absolutely crucial for understanding where he goes next.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at a global human tragedy. Then we'll travel back to the 6th century world, move into his critique of the West, and wrap up with reforming Muslims, not Islam.
All right, starting with part 1. A global human tragedy and the collapse of a foundation. In the preface, the fall of the Islamic State is framed as something completely different from your typical aging empire falling apart. You know, history is full of kings dying and borders shifting, and the universe rarely sheds a tear over that, right? But the author argues that the retreat of Muslim leadership was a catastrophic global tragedy. Why? Because it wasn't just a government collapsing, it was the decadence of a specific, vital message. He actually compares this message to the spirit to the body of human society. So when that foundation collapsed, the argument is that the whole world essentially lost its ethical and spiritual anchor. Now this is where it gets really interesting. The text redefines a very specific term, ignorance or jahiliyyah. In the foreword, we find out he's not talking about just a simple lack of historical or scientific knowledge. Instead, he uses ignorance to describe a specific attitude of mind, a materialist worldview that totally takes over whenever ethical leadership is missing. It's this state where human behavior is driven by sophisticated but ultimately debased appetites, rather than any sort of divine standard. And Nadwi contends that this exact spirit of materialism is plaguing the world today, just like it did in the past.
Which brings us to part 2, the 6th century world standing on the edge of the precipice.
The text points to the 6th century as the foundational, historical proof of a world just drowning in this materialist ignorance right before Islam came into the picture. And honestly, it's wild how he draws parallels to our own modern anxieties here. He paints this era as literally the darkest phase of human history. Humanity is described as teetering on the edge of a precipice. In what the book calls a melancholy progress from God-forgetfulness to self-forgetting, man had just completely lost his direction. The teachings of past prophets, totally forgotten. The few who still cared about spiritualism had basically hidden away in monasteries, leaving everybody else completely vanquished by materialism.
To illustrate this, the author draws this super stark contrast between the two dominant global powers of the time, the Romans in the West and the Persians in the East. Both empires had a monopoly on global leadership, but according to the text, both had sunk into just absolute moral depravity. The ruling classes were reportedly drunk with power, indulging in reckless debauchery, while everyday people lived in grinding poverty. They were basically toiling like cattle just so the elite could live in total luxury. These massive civilizations were, in his view, rotting right from the inside out.
And to really drive home this total lack of unified spiritual guidance, he points to the intense religious chaos of the era. Take the Roman Empire, for example. The deep theological battles within Christianity, specifically between the Melkite Christians in Syria who believed Jesus was both divine and human, and the Monophysites in Egypt who believed he was solely divine. Well, this wasn't just some polite philosophical debate. The text points out that it escalated into an all-out civil war. Both sides were attacking each other as apostates, leading to savage persecutions and brutal atrocities. The world was just completely fractured.
And this is brilliantly illustrated by bringing in an outside, non-Muslim historian to validate these claims. He quotes Edward Gibbon, who confirms the profound depression and decay of Rome during this period. Gibbon says the lofty tree of civilization had lost its leaves and branches, leaving nothing but a sapless trunk withering on the ground. So the stage was set. You have a world completely hollowed out from the inside, desperately in need of a new foundation. Let's move on to part 3, the critique of the West, and what he calls a wilderness of fear.
This brings us to the core critique of modern Western civilization, and it's broken down into a really stark comparison: quantitative versus qualitative. Nadawi acknowledges, sure, the West has absolutely mastered the quantitative material world. We've got tremendous advances in science, technology, practical utility, you name it. But he fiercely argues that the West has utterly failed the qualitative, spiritual world. It's a surprisingly modern observation, actually, this idea that despite all our immense technological progress, we've subordinated transcendental ethics to mere practical utility. And the result? It's led humanity into global distress, a wilderness of fear, greed, loneliness, and spiritual despair.
Because of this severe imbalance, the text views the blind admiration for Western progress within Islamic countries as a really dangerous urge. The argument is that Western appetites are purely material, built on a structure that is ultimately inimical, meaning deeply harmful or hostile to the actual needs of the human mind and spirit. So trying to forcefully modify the practical teachings of Islam just to fit into this Western socioeconomic mold? He argues that threatens to destroy the very roots of the Islamic moral and social code altogether. Which leads perfectly into our final section, Part 4, Reforming Muslims, Not Islam, and his ultimate call to action.
So here is the absolutely crucial point. The author fiercely argues that the religion of Islam itself is not obsolete. It hasn't expired. Instead, he asserts that what looks like the decay of Islam is actually the decay and bankruptcy of the hearts of the Muslims themselves. According to the text, the followers have reduced the religion to just a dry husk. It's a body without a soul. They've stripped it of its dynamism, its purpose, and have become, in his words, too small and too lazy to respond to the divine call.
So how do you fix that? Well, the solution he proposes is basically a massive internal revolution. He lays out a clear path to regeneration. First up, Muslims have to stop trying to reform their religion to match Western materialism. Instead, they need to reform themselves. This means creating an intense inner awakening, a permanent spiritual consciousness. They have to revive the deep sense of responsibility and action that was seen in the early companions of the Prophet. Essentially, stop treating the religion like a museum exhibit and start putting the dynamic core ideas underlying the Quran into active, real-world practice once again.
And that brings us to the author's final provocative question, drawn straight from the text. Will the West listen to this voice? Nadawi boldly claims that all of our breathtaking scientific achievements are ultimately going to be useless until we see a matching improvement in human behavior and spiritual ethics. It really forces us to step back and reflect. Can modern civilization ever truly balance its massive quantitative technological power with the fundamental qualitative needs of the human soul? It's a heavy question, for sure, and one that definitely leaves us with a whole lot to think about.